welcome to In Search of the Crystal Skull, the epic adventure through the cinematic jungle of mediocrity. My name is Arun.
My name is Patricia.
And Mrs. Patricia, the dude looks like a lady in this one.
Yes, indeed. I wonder if we'll have any luck with the lady tonight.
Oh, well, I guess we'll have to see. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to introduce you to the world of Mrs. Doubtfire.
So, Mrs. Doubtfire was a 1993 American comedy film directed by Christopher Columbus, and it was written by, the screenplay was written by Randy Mayhem Singer and Leslie Dixon, and is based off of the book Alias Madame Doubtfire by Anne Fine, and it stars Robin Williams, Sally Field, Pierce Brosnan, Harvey Fierstein, and Robert Prosky. And the movie came out on November 24th of 1993, and it received $441.3 million in the box office with a $25 million budget. Now, the movie, if you look at it on Rotten Tomatoes, it may be pretty surprising for some people. It's like, really? You're talking about Mrs. Doubtfire? But that's a classic, according to a lot of people. It's like, oh, this is a movie with Robin Williams, and he dresses up as a woman. And, you know, it's supposed to be a really funny movie when you watch it as a kid, but when you watch it as an adult, it's like, oh man, this movie is about like these two having a divorce and they're pretty miserable and all that kind of stuff. Well, believe it or not, according to Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 72% rating. And I'm just going to read off some of the critiques of this movie. Yeah, according to some people, when this movie came out, I mean, they thought it was really funny. I mean, especially since, you know, Robin Williams was at the peak of his career. You know, we already discussed in depth about various stuff that Robin Williams has done, such as like The Lion, Aladdin, and there was The Fisher King, and there was a whole bunch of other movies that he was doing. But, I would say that there was some decent reviews with it, but I'm just going to look up some critiques of it really quickly.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll also mention a couple of things as well, and that is, this is actually 67th in the American Film Institute's 100 Laughs, and is also 40th in Bravo's 100 Funniest Movies of All Time. Now, some of you would say, well, surely that shouldn't mean that. It's actually, given the fact that it's even on the top 100, that it should not be a mediocre film and should not be in this series, but there are some things that are holding it back, and so I thought maybe we could do an episode. Maybe you'll agree with some of the things we have to say, maybe you'll disagree with some of the things that we have to say, but let's give it a whole look over and a full body makeover, should we say, and let's see what we come up with.
Yeah. I think I have one of the critics right here, Roger Ebert. I'm sure you guys already know who he is. But for those who don't, Roger Ebert was a very famous critic around the 70s, throughout the 80s, and even all the way until his passing a few years ago. But, you know, he and Gene Siskel had a arrangement of like TV shows, and they did like newspaper articles and online stuff in recent years. But let me tell you about what he briefly said about Mrs. Doubtfire. So any review of Mrs. Doubtfire must take into account Dustin Hoffman's transvestite comedy Tootsie, which remains by far the better film. It's more believable, it's more intelligent, and funnier. Tootsie grew out of real wit and insight, while Mrs. Doubtfire has the values and depth of a sitcom. Hoffman was an actor when being able to play as a woman, while Williams seems to be more playing himself, playing as a woman. So yeah, I think that there were some critiques at the time.
Here's the thing about, and who am I to argue against the incredible Roger Ebert? But the one thing I would say, like, you go to a Robin Williams film expecting to see Robin Williams. Like, you know, it's like, it's one of the reasons why Aladdin was so great, you know, in a way that, besides the fact that it was actually part of the Disney Renaissance era. But, you know, Robin Williams made a lot of that movie, you know. And
that is very true. Yeah. But and not to mention that you have to remember that he also did a lot of more dramatic films, like Good Morning Vietnam was a bit of comedy, but at the same time it was a bit dramatic. So was The Fisher King, and also Dead Poets Society. So I guess this is kind of like around the time in which he was definitely focusing a lot more on being comedic. Aladdin, and then a few years later we had Jumanji and the Night of Museum trilogy, and he gone back to a bit of like drama again with some of his other films, such as like Good Will Hunting, 1 Hour Photo, where you get to see a more like scarier side of him because it was a horror movie where he was playing as a stalker who worked at a film developing store. So yeah, I mean, he is a very ranged actor, but I think around the 90s, a lot more people knew about him for his comedy.
But anyway, going into Mrs. Doubtfire itself, and we'll take a look at this. I mean, let's take a look at this at face. I mean, look at the what's on the surface of this. So basically, it's about a voice actor who is obviously sticks to some certain principles and things, and also is quite fun loving as well. However, he kind of is very neglectful of the fact that his wife is very hardworking and that she can't always be there, and obviously they have this massive party for their children along without her. And she's obviously not very happy about that. And then obviously she finds out the fact that her husband constantly keeps dropping work because of obviously his principles and things like that. And then eventually that's basically they both come to blows, and eventually that ends up with a divorce. So I mean, that's obviously the very beginning of it. But then we enter into the divorce proceedings, where now it turns out that Robin Williams is obviously not going to get to see his kids as often as he would like to, and also he's quite worried about basically what they're getting up to. So he comes up with this a very elaborate scheme of basically fooling his ex-wife now into believing that there's all these really terrible like babysitters and sitters that just aren't capable of being able of being up for the job, and constantly keeps calling up with these other voices that he does, obviously doing his old voice actor spiel. Then he finally decides to call up and tries to fake in being like the real deal Mrs. Doubtfire. Obviously, then he goes into this whole nice Scottish lady accent, and then she ends up realizing that he's come up with this whole thing of making himself really pleasant and really nice sounding, but doesn't realize that he's not got a name for this character, and then ends up obviously having to read out a headline of a newspaper spitting out Doubtfire as Mrs. Doubtfire. So I guess one thing about, when people talk about like the believability, like can you really believe that somebody can don up like a full bodysuit and also just basically put on a very a somewhat realistic looking mask, something that's is not gonna, obviously doesn't have much uncanny valley to it, and then be able to go into this household and be able to basically to fool everybody. And so,
here's the thing. Now, if any of you guys have ever read the original book, alias Miss Madame Doubtfire, according to the book,
I am not one of those people, by the way.
Neither have I, but my buddy James Sullivan, aka Jaimitude, he does this series called From Pages to Pictures, actually did do a comparison between the book and the movie. And there are some similarities, but man, is it like the tone is way different. It's a lot more mean-spirited. And it's more geared for adults because it was an adult novel. It wasn't like geared with a mixture for kids and adults. So in the novel, from what I understand, the kids recognized that was their father in the disguise the entire time. The only one who didn't know, I think even like Lydia, the youngest, even figured it out. It was the mother who couldn't figure it out, even though that it was plainly obvious. But basically, I guess they decided to like make it a little bit more realistic, where Daniel, who's played by Robin Williams, he has a brother who is a makeup artist, and then they thought, oh, maybe we can have him as a character so that he can be able to transform a much more believable way. Like, they're putting on the makeup, they're putting on the mask and all that kind of stuff, and then eventually they try different wigs, and then he gets his outfit, and pretty much throughout the beginning of the movie, they're completely fooled. They have no idea Mrs. Doubtfire is their father, or, for Miranda's sake, her ex-husband.
Mm-hmm. And so, the one thing that I really like about this is that it's just that Robin Williams makes this character. At one point in the movie, you actually do feel like there's a difference between Daniel and Mrs. Doubtfire. Like, he just comes up with this whole other person. So you start to kind of at one point I kind of this, it's kind of it was in a way was also intaken by his taking on this persona of Mrs. Doubtfire. So at one point I was like, oh hey, this feels like another character that Robin Williams is actually playing on the screen right now. And so because obviously he talks about like how Paul Winston got hit by a Guinness truck, and like you're following along with the lines and things like that, and like how she never loved again and stuff like that. And obviously she's just doing that because she wants to try and keep his ex-wife away from from trying to get to somebody else. But in comes Pierce Brosnan.
Yes, Pierce Brosnan as Stu. And, he's your typical British dashing guy who, at one point he and Miranda were dating, but, then he went away for a few years starting off his own business. And then he goes over to Miranda's business where they're talking about decorating, his new facility. And she gives him tablecloths and napkins and all that kind of stuff. Well, he's more interested in asking her out on a date and reacquainting again. And then she's mentioning that, she's in the middle of a divorce, and, he's very understanding. And then slowly, as time goes on with the divorce being more finalized, that's when they started dating each other. Mm-hmm. And that's when Daniel decides that, he's going to not only use the persona of Mrs. Doubtfire from, so that he can be able to see his kids more often because he could only see them once a week, but also to prevent Miranda from dating Stu so that maybe they could, have a second chance.
By the way, just sorry to segue into this, but is this the first ever movie we're doing which stars Mara Wilson that we're talking about?
No. I don't think so. I think Mara Wilson was also doing other stuff, but
no. I'm talking about you and I. Like, is this the first? Is this the first Mara Wilson?
Yeah, you're absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I mean, as of the recording of this podcast, we haven't even done the Matilda podcast yet for the Roald Dahl retrospective.
Yeah, so like, hey Mara, well, welcome to the club. You finally started talking about you. So there you go.
That's right. Yeah. Welcome to the club, indeed. Yeah. I have to say that for this being one of her, first acting roles, this was her. I'm trying to look this up. I have her filmography here. Oh yeah, this was the first movie that she was ever in. She was in TV and in commercials, but yeah, this was the first movie she was ever starring in, where she played as Natty.
You could tell at the very beginning that she had some kind of talent, So like you could tell that there was something. She was a sweet little girl, like on the screen, who was like who was taken in by obviously this whole Mrs. Doubtfire character. That is until she actually found out that it was actually him, but it was, and then she was like playing along with the whole act and everything like that, and so that in itself was quite fun.
She's supposed to be playing as like the sweet little innocent girl, while we have Christopher and we have Lydia, who are teenagers. So they're going through like major struggles. Like Christopher is not doing very well with his grades, and Lydia is trying to keep the family together with the separation between her father and her mother. There's actually a deleted scene, if you actually own the movie on DVD, where she talks to her dad alone while they're going out on their weekend, their Saturday trip, and she's trying to tell him like, work harder to try to spend time with us, and try to, see if you can maybe, agree with mom in court or something. And he's saying that it's a little bit more complicated than she realizes. I believe that's in the book, but they cut it off from the final product of the movie. Again, if you want to see it in more detail, then you could, if you have it on DVD, you could watch it on one of the deleted scenes.
It just me also is that, does Miranda in this movie come across as unreasonable? Like, obviously her reaction to finding out that, Daniel this entire time has been Mrs. Doubtfire. That's reason. I think that's kind of like how I can really sympathize with her in like her time that she felt like, I don't know. Like,
okay, well, let's think about it. Like in the beginning of the movie, we see that Daniel is a struggling voice actor. In the book, he's a regular actor. I think he's a theater actor. But so we have him constantly yelling at his superior, saying, oh, you can't do this to this character because there's a cartoon that's being played where he has to do both of the voices of the cat and the bird, where the cat is shoving the bird a cigarette and he is smoking, and Daniel's saying like, oh, this is terrible, you can't do that, that's horrible for kids. And then they were saying, like, you have to do what the cartoon shows. If there is a scene in which a character is smoking and you have to look through the lip flaps, then that's exactly what you have to say. And they were like, I like the scene in which, like, it was kind of hypocritical where Daniel was asking about, like, smoking is bad for the youth of America, and everybody is smoking in the background. And so then he pretty much quits, and apparently, like, he has lost his job a lot of times. So because he's losing his job, Miranda's pretty much the breadwinner of the household. And then we saw that Chris has not been doing well in school, and so he's not allowed to have a birthday party until he gets his grades up. And so Daniel goes behind her back, where they invite all these kids, and then they invite all these animals, which is pretty illegal, by the way. You cannot invite, all these animals in, like, this secluded neighborhood, unless, of course, if you have a permit, which that's completely doubtful that he did. And so you have the scenes in which when you see the kids, like, acting up and the whole place is a mess, and then she's just, like, completely shocked about all of this. And so she yells at Daniel for not only causing the mess, but also, like, all these violations that the police is, like, writing her up on. And she's just really frustrated. The fact that not only can he not keep a job, but that she cannot rely on Daniel for being a responsible adult.
Okay, then maybe what she did was reasonable then. Okay, I
think here's the thing that when you're a kid and you're watching this, it's like, oh, but they're having fun. It's a birthday party, and then you realize what's behind. Yeah, and then you think that, oh man, she's just being mean. She's a stick in the mud. But then when you watch more closer, it's like, yeah, you actually do kind of root for Miranda in this, because her husband is, being constantly out of work. I mean, they live in San Francisco, which means that they probably have one of the more expensive houses to live in. And the fact that she constantly works and her husband's struggling and her kids are struggling, it's like she pretty much, like, has been taking care of these kids in a way, while Daniel's kind of like an overgrown child. It's kind of, funny when looking at the movie from two different perspectives.
Yeah. Anyway, going back to Pierce Brosnan in this movie, and I don't know, because at the time when I saw, I think I was a bit late coming into Mrs. Doubtfire, to be honest with you, when I first, like, saw it for, like, the absolute first time, because when I saw Mrs. Doubtfire, I knew Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. And so it was a bit jarring to kind of, like, watch, Pierce Brosnan walk in as Stu, this guy who's in this wacky movie, and I don't know whether it was, I don't know whether to think if it was brilliant casting or whether it was kind of like just distracting bad casting.
Well, I mean, you have to remember that this came out before he was in James Bond, so I think that Pierce Brosnan, I think he did a pretty decent job, and I'm the complete opposite of you, Aaron, in which I have never seen a James Bond movie, but I grew up with this movie. This was actually one of my favorite movies as a kid. I would watch this movie so many times, it's not even funny. But yeah, I think that the casting for me wasn't that much of a big deal. But I mean, as for, like, when you know about him in, like, all the James Bond movies, then I can kind of see where you're coming from.
Yeah, like, all of a sudden, like, it's like you're watching him, like, kick ass in GoldenEye. By the way, this was, like, 2 years after Mrs. Doubtfire, by the way. So, obviously, it was, I think it was around about, like, 96, 97, I think I saw Mrs. Doubtfire for the first time, I think. So, like, it was a good couple of years afterwards. So, like, knowing he was, like, also, GoldenEye is, like, one of my favorite James Bond movies of all time. Like, I love GoldenEye. I love the Nintendo 64 game as well. But it's to go from that to, watching him kick ass in that movie, and then all of a sudden it's kind of like, oh, hey, here he comes trying to take, Miranda away from, Daniel in this movie, and then obviously he's putting his charms through. I mean, obviously I get that it was a couple of years before, obviously he became Bond, but, it still feels a little bit weird, watching him in this movie, and I tell you what, it feels absolutely abstract to know that he was in Mamma Mia, like, a couple of years after that as well. But but Pierce Brosnan, I'm a bit on. It still feels kind of weird to watch him in this movie, kind of like be, Miranda's. Miranda's you're trying to get in with Miranda, if you will. So, then you see that he's obviously Robin Williams is opposite. fit in every single way. Like, he's got a really expensive car. He's obviously got a really, he's far more better looking than than Robin Williams, I will admit. And he's obviously got, he obviously seems to have a good, well-paying job as well. I can't remember exactly what his employment status was in Mrs. Doubtfire. Did he actually say what he worked as?
They did in the beginning of the movie, where I think that it was involving with some sort. I know that he was starting his own business, because because that was part. No, he was restoring an old mansion. That's what it was. Oh. He bought a mansion and he was restoring it, and he was hiring Miranda to help with designing it, because she's a designer and she did all these things. And so that's why you have them coming together in the movie, because he's this really big entrepreneur who's interested in purchasing old mansions and refurbishing them into either fancy restaurants or hotels or something like that. So have you
ever noticed every time Robin Williams is in a movie, there's always somebody trying to do some kind of restoration or something like that? Like that was the woman that he fell in love with in Bicentennial Man. She was restoring artifacts and things like that. So,
yeah, I guess. Yeah, it is kind of interesting, isn't it? So continuing on. So basically, the going from Pierce Brosnan's character. So we have the other characters. We have obviously Daniel's brother, who's played by Harvey Fierstein, and I know a lot about Harvey Fierstein because he's been in very films such as he was Yao in Mulan. In Broadway, he was Edna Turnblad in Hairspray, and he was in Independence Day. So yeah, he's been in a few movies, and if any of you guys know about him personally, that he is very openly gay. So it's actually kind of interesting to see him playing as a makeup artist who is openly gay, and he has a partner alongside with him who is trying to work with Daniel so that he can be able to look more like Mrs. Doubtfire.
Yeah, it's just talking about the soundtrack as well. Obviously, it's probably not too. It's obviously not all that outrageous now, but obviously this soundtrack had Aerosmith, Frank Sinatra, House of Pain, and James Brown all involved in it. So.
Yeah, well, the reason why is because it was, I know it sounds kind of weird, but when we were talking about Sonic the Hedgehog, you remember that each and every single one of them had the word either speed, fast, or Sonic. So each and every single one of these songs, even though that they're done by completely different artists, they all have something to do with either being a woman or ladies. So it has a continuous theme going on in this movie, which... I actually remember the songs in Mrs. Doubtfire even a little bit more than Sonic the Hedgehog, even though that they did have a consistent theme as well.
I mean, what do you think of the soundtrack to Mrs. Doubtfire? I mean, it was some of it was kind of your generic, oh hey, it's all well in, well not all that well in suburbia, but he obviously played up for the drama and things like that. But there's not a bit of music that I would say a theme to Mrs. Doubtfire that I would have just said, oh hey, I know that from the Mrs. Doubtfire movie.
Yeah, that's true, and it was done by Howard Shore, who he would be doing the soundtrack for Lord of the Rings and Hobbit later on, which that soundtrack is very well known for people even still to this day. But yeah, I think that the instrumental songs in the background, they're not really that memorable compared to the songs that are played in the movie.
Yeah. So, I mean, just also focusing on, I guess we could talk about the controversy. I think probably this movie will probably have now, because obviously it's Robin Williams in drag. I mean, let's be honest about this. Obviously, it's him obviously pretending to be a woman, and so I mean, I guess there will be some parts of society that would probably take exceptions to that. But obviously, I mean, one thing I'll say, it's a movie that was made in the 90s. I mean, we're probably going to go through a lot of movies that have themes that probably wouldn't be appropriate today.
Yeah, and as mentioned before, and I'm looking through more of the critiques of this movie, that they compared this movie to Some Like It Hot and Tootsie. Tootsie was definitely a movie that they brought up a lot because they felt that Tootsie was a better executed film. And a lot of people felt that, even though that the movie was, it was, pretty sentimental, and it had its messages clear, that they felt that Robin Williams was the one that shined out the most. Like everything else paled in comparison to Robin Williams's performance.
Yeah, I guess one critique I guess we could also put on the movie is that, I mean, it is basically the Robin Williams show. Basically, this movie, like Robin Williams is the
kind of
star.
Like how when Liar Liar first came out in theaters, pretty much everyone said that while the plot wasn't that deep, Jim Carrey's performance was the one that pretty much stood out. He carried that whole movie.
Yeah, I mean, like it's surprising that Mara Wilson actually was put up for like any other considerations for any other movies, because here's Robin Williams front and center, and you didn't really get to spend all that much time with the other characters, unless Robin Williams was there. I mean, and obviously you saw him in the montages where he's obviously trying to help his kids out with his schoolwork. Obviously reading to Mara Wilson on screen and doing other things around the house, which basically it was just playing up this gag of Daniel basically dressing up as this house nanny and just fooling the majority of people anyway with what he was doing. So I mean, like, it was there was not much meat, I think, in regards to like the way the other characters are. I think some people, there could be arguments to be made that
right.
I mean, it's kind of. I mean, I won't say it's as bad as Mr. Nanny, where basically it was Hulk Hogan who basically was sticking out like a sore thumb in that entire movie, with some like Home Alone and like some elements of Mrs. Doubtfire kind of stuck into that movie, I guess you could say. But I mean, it's not as bad as that, but it is. I mean, it kind of shrinks the world a little bit, where it's kind of like, oh hey, it's whatever. It's kind of like the whole movie seems to kind of like orbit around Robin Williams, and it's whatever asteroid or moon or whatever kind of like floats around into his orbit. I think you could say is that it's the only time where you can honestly say that here's the side characters of that. I mean, if you look at, what other things were big at that time? Like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was a pretty big thing, I think, at that time, wasn't it? Like, it was, the whole thing wasn't just about Will Smith. I mean, obviously you have James Avery as Uncle Phil. You had, Alfonso as Colton, and you had various other people there as well who had their own. I mean, obviously it's different because it's a series, so you have a whole bunch of episodes to kind of like build characters. Obviously, that Mrs. Doubtfire obviously doesn't have that luxury, but I mean, you could obviously say, like a couple of episodes, I guess you could say in like maybe 3 episodes, which would be enough for a movie of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, you could identify everybody in that, including Jazz in the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But in Mrs. Doubtfire, the one person you walk away from, if it's not Pierce Brosnan being kind of like this character that kind of really stands out in my eyes in some way, in a kind of distracting way, obviously the one character you're going to take away from is Daniel, who's played by Robin Williams, who plays this wacky character, Mrs. Doubtfire.
And it's kind of funny because, Sally Field is also in this movie. And if you remember, a few years prior, she won many Golden Globes, various awards for her performance. And, she was the, famous one where she said, you like me, you really like me. But, I mean, her performance as Miranda is also very well done. I mean, I guess you could say that both of them do a pretty well job, good job. But, and also, Pierce Brosnan also does a pretty good job as well, even though that I'm sure that, I would have wished personally if he gotten a little bit more development and maybe how the kids would have reacted to him. It kind of feels like, my kind of complaint with Officer Bronco from Onward. It's like, the kids seem to like him just fine, but I wish that there would have been a little bit more conflict. Maybe because they knew that Mrs. Doubtfire was their dad, but then that brings up even more questions. Like, maybe they could have brought more about it, but...
I'm just looking at all the movies that Sally Field actually went on to do after Mrs. Doubtfire, and obviously she was in Forrest Gump, and she was in Forrest Gump. I mean, she had a part in King of the Hill at one point, and then she was in Little Mermaid's Ariel's Beginning.
And not to mention that she was also in the Amazing Spider-Man movies, where she played as Aunt May.
That's a pretty big role.
She was also. Yeah, that is a huge role. And also she was Mary Todd Lincoln in Lincoln, which was, a Steven Spielberg production, but that's to be expected. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, she's done just as much in television, movies, and in theater. So yeah, she's still like really prominent.
Mm-hmm. And right now she's just doing TV. So she's obviously doing Dispatches from Elsewhere.
Yeah, there you go. So she's still doing really well.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean there are a few characters that kind of like come and go pretty quickly, like Mrs. Sellner, who is Daniel's kind of what was she like? She was kind of like always there to like inspect his house to make sure that everything was like neat and ready. She basically helped him. No, she was his court liaison. That's what it was. So she was his court liaison, and Daniel was given two things to do by the judge. He needed to find a job and he needed to get an apartment within 3 months. And Mrs. Sellner was going to his apartment every Monday and Friday evenings to inspect everything to see if it looked, appropriate for the children and to see if he was on the right track to abiding for what the judge said. And, she's there in the beginning of the movie, but then she kind of just leaves, like when she goes over to the house to inspect it, and then Mrs. Doubtfire is there because that was when he was doing his first night as Mrs. Doubtfire. And then she never shows up in the movie again.
Yeah, it's kind of like I mean, I guess there was no more reason to kind of like have her in other scenes. I guess because I mean, the only way that this whole thing was going to, kind of fall up. I mean, if this whole thing kind of fell apart, it wouldn't fall apart in front of her. It would fall apart in front of the judge, and obviously it did fall apart in the. With the judge in the final third of the movie, but so I don't think there was much reason to kind of like have her there, except just to kind of like remind us that obviously this is a thing. But I didn't think it needs to be a constant reminder. I don't think. So there's more. Exactly. There's other. I mean, this is the critique I have of this movie. I mean, this movie's already too small enough to begin with. I mean, like a reoccurring characters, I think is just going to be a problem. I think in all of this.
I guess so. So in the third act, we're introduced to Jonathan Lundy, who is like the main guy behind the TV studio that Daniel works at. So his job is to pack and ship the film so that it could be distributed to the other television studios. And Jonathan Lundy is just there, and there's this kids show that's being played in the background, which is like very dull and boring. It's like if Mr. Rogers was taking away all of his charm and just stayed out the most generic facts about dinosaurs. And so Daniel meets up with Mr. Lundy and discussing about like he can do a better job. And so he becomes a much more prominent character in the third act because Daniel is playing around with the dinosaurs and Mr. Lundy is very impressed with his performance. And so he decides to invite him over for a meeting at Lundy's restaurant, which happens to go at the same day of Miranda's birthday, where she's inviting Stu and the kids over, and she wants to come in. She wants to invite Daniel as Mrs. Doubtfire. So basically, you have that scene in which that Daniel has to switch between himself and Mrs. Doubtfire and have to like play things off, which it does get pretty stressful at times, but it does get pretty hilarious at some points.
Mm-hmm. So I think I mean going towards the end of the movie, obviously it was it's kind of nice. I mean, how do you feel about the fact that it all kind of came together full circle in some way? Like it was like Robin Williams finally got his big break as being Mrs. Doubtfire on TV. And then all of a sudden it was kind of like, oh hey, well, all that legal stuff, we've taken care of that now, and Daniel's not going to get to see his kids every weekend, pretty much.
Yeah, and it started off pretty rough too. Again, we're like going into another deleted scene from the movie, which plays off in the book. So after Daniel is revealed as Mrs. Doubtfire, they go over to the house and they just argue. They fight with each other, and it is very brutal. And then you have Lydia out there hearing the whole conversation alongside with Chris and Matt and Natty, and then she yells at them, "I hate you both." And then they just hear the conversation and they realize how miserable that their arguments have affected the kids. So after that, then we go over to the scene in which when, Daniel has to no longer be as Mrs. Doubtfire, and the judge basically says, "You have a problem. I'm going to give you supervised visits for your children, and I'm going to have you go through therapy and all that stuff because you are doing very harmful things by dressing up as a woman just so you can see your kid." And so then we go over to Miranda trying to get another babysitter for the kids, and none of them meet the standards of Mrs. Doubtfire. And then we get into the scene in which when Daniel gets that big break where she decides to use the persona of Mrs. Doubtfire as a kids show host. So that's when Daniel gets his big break, and then he and Miranda come to an agreement about that Daniel can see his kids more often.
Yeah. Do you think it was kind of rushed towards going to the end? I mean, like, do you think that?
I mean, there was a lot more details in the book. Like, there was a lot more gatherings with the children, and the fight scene actually the one that was cut from the movie. In the book, it lasts for a long time. You were talking about like 6 pages worth of arguing and bickering. And
yeah, but I think it's expected that the book's going to have far, far, far more detail than the movie. I mean, like, that was the argument put towards The Lord of the Rings. That's the argument that was put towards Watchmen, basically. Like, it's just going to be expected that the reading material is going to give us far more than what, the screen can ever give us, basically.
That's very true, yes.
Yeah, so I think that's a common argument, I think, for most movies that are based on books.
Yeah, very fair. So, yeah, I mean, there are some scenes that, you're absolutely... I scene where Daniel and Miranda go back home after Daniel was discovered as Mrs. Doubtfire. I felt like they should have kept that. I know that the court scene was also very strong, but I felt that the drama and the buildup should have been built up a little bit better. And there are some scenes that are kind of rushed, like the transition from Mrs. Doubtfire having her own TV show just from that one meeting with Mr. Lundy. I felt that, maybe Mr. Lundy could have played a bit of a role in there. Like maybe he would have saw what happened in the background. It's like, maybe, he would have thought that, oh, maybe, this guy is having problems with his family. Like maybe I should have another meeting to talk about all this. It's like, I felt that there should have been another scene there.
Yeah. But keep in mind, I mean, how long did the movie go on for? It was a quite a long movie, I think, for what we got. I think.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, it's 120 minutes, but
yeah, exactly. So I mean, for your fun kind of comedic, hey, here's a guy dressing up as an old woman movie. I think it went on for long enough.
I guess that's true. But maybe they're
actually, hang on a second. It actually went on longer than that. Actually, I've got 2 hours and 6 minutes.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah, so it went on for a long time. Okay, so it was a 2-hour movie, and so I think it was enough to kind of hold everyone's attention. So so I think in the long run, I mean, do we argue that it's a bit unfair to call this movie mediocre? I guess. I mean,
of course not. Why would no? I mean, there's some flaws in it, sure, but no, it's not a mediocre movie by any standards. This is definitely one of Robin best films that he's
and there
done.
was arguments for years about a sequel as well. Was. Do you
remember a few years ago that they were planning on that Mrs. Doubtfire stage play, and in addition to that, they were going to do that Robin Williams sequel where they're taking place many years later with the kids grown up. But then when Robin Williams took his life away, that project got canceled.
Yeah, and so sadly after Robin Williams, I mean, also some of that as well, Robin Williams at that time wasn't in good health. So maybe that in itself was probably not going to be great either. I don't think. So I think it's going to be one of those what ifs. I mean, what if there was a Mrs. Doubtfire sequel? And mind you, in Hollywood, and there's obviously there's nothing stopping them from rebooting the movie. Unfortunately, so
that's very true. I mean, yeah, but I think that. Yeah, if they do reboot the movie, I think that it's probably not going to be as beloved as the original. Well, unless, of course, if they wanted to, stick closer to the book.
It's been a good couple of years now since
it is true. It's been over 25 years.
Exactly. So I mean, they could probably get away with basically making. Well, I mean, it probably will end up being terrible, knowing what Hollywood probably do to it. But I mean, I think it's just going to go through the modern tropes, and then I think after that, I think people are just going to complain about it, and then it'll just go away.
Yeah. Now, if they want to do it that was more closer to the book, then maybe. But it's going to be a bit hard to reboot it. It's like, remember when Tom and Jerry, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was released 1 year after Gene Wilder's death, and they thought it was like a shameful, disgusting movie to release after his death. So, I mean, yeah, I have a really strong feeling that for some fans who are saying, you're releasing a reboot of Mrs. Doubtfire, knowing that, Robin Williams took himself away, I have a really strong feeling that maybe that would be the case for some people.
Yeah. Anyway, we got to give scores. So, okay. I guess with Mrs. Doubtfire, I got to be honest with you. I was really entertained by Mrs. Doubtfire. Yes, there were some distractions in it and everything like that, but I got to be honest with you. I would actually give it an 8.
Me too. I would give it an 8 out of 10 as well. It's really funny, very. The actors are really good, and also it has a very compelling lesson about divorce. If kids are watching this, then they would learn a valuable lesson that, just because the parents get divorced doesn't mean that they don't love you. They just feel that, being separated helps them and they can become better parents. And I think that that's a great lesson for kids. I mean, it's a lesson that doesn't get taught enough in kids shows. Mm-hmm. And yes, there are a few flaws in the movie. Like, the one takeaway that you're going to get is that you're going to remember Robin Williams' performance the most out of anybody. And also, there could have been a few scenes that would have been fleshed out a little bit more. But other than that, this movie is really good. And if you haven't seen it yet, then go check it out. It doesn't deserve to be ranked among the mediocre movies on Rotten Tomatoes. I can understand critiques back in 1993, but nowadays I think it's been re-evaluated and vindicated as a Robin Williams classic.
Mm-hmm. And so we end another adventure in Search for the Crystal Skull. So my name is Arun.
My name is Patricia.
Take care and bye for now.
See you later.